It's not the bears, the wolves, or the storms that get you in the wilderness. It's what you bring with you: grief, guilt, obsession. Sometimes it's the person beside you. These are true stories of wilderness guides who thought they were leading others into nature, only to stumble into something far darker. Because out there, beyond the trail markers and the fire pits, something waits. And it's not always something you can explain.
Story 1. The Disappearance at Beartooth Mountain. I spent 16 years in the Marine Corps. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. I don't talk about them much, not because I'm haunted or broken or anything cinematic like that, but because, after a while, the stories blend into each other. Dirt, adrenaline, waiting, and the thump of distant mortars. When I got out around the 2017 holidays, it was like slamming into a wall I didn't see coming. There was no ceremony or closure, no one saying, "Good job, you're done now." It was just silence. And that silence got loud real fast. I tried to keep myself busy, drove Uber for a bit, helped a buddy from my old platoon get a landscaping gig off the ground, even did a stint as a celebrity bodyguard. Each job taught me the same thing. I'm not made for the civilian world. Or maybe it's the civilian world that's not made for me. Working with Marines is different. There's order, discipline. We might be rough, loud, even reckless, but we run on a code. You don't get that in everyday life. Driving people around LA traffic while listening to housewives treat you like dirt because they think you're a driver, or watching paparazzi swarm your client like rats on garbage, it drains you. It wears you down in a way war never did. I missed the structure, missed the brotherhood. I even missed the silence of a night watch post in the middle of nowhere. That kind of silence has purpose. There was a moment where I almost caved and joined a private security firm. I'd sworn I wouldn't go that route. Too mercenary, too gray area, but I was desperate, and desperate men justify things. Then, during a coffee with another ex-Marine who'd been working in the private sector, the conversation took a strange turn. He said, "You don't need guns or politics or suits. You need the woods." I thought he was joking. But he told me about a guy he knew, a Marine like us, who couldn't hold down a regular job either. Hated every damn one of them. Then one day, almost on a dare, the guy signs up to be a wilderness guide. That was 4 years ago. He's still doing it. He hikes, he camps, he teaches survival skills to people who pay him more than minimum wage. He picks his clients, makes his own hours, and lives life on his own terms. I couldn't get the idea out of my head. It was like someone had flipped a switch inside me. 3 months later, I was heading up to Fresno for an interview with a veteran-owned wilderness company. The guy running it was solid, knew his stuff, respected my background, and after an hour offered me a job. No suit, no corporate jargon, no need to smile when I didn't feel like it. Just trees, trails, and people who wanted to learn how not to die out there. I thought I'd found peace. Turns out, I'd only found the edge of something much darker. Chuck wasn't his real name. That's just what I call him now. For privacy reasons, sure, but also because there's something about giving a name to someone who disappeared that makes them harder to forget. It was a Friday morning when I first met him, just after sunrise. We'd spoken earlier in the week, standard pre-hike briefing, but seeing him in person added a new layer to the mystery I hadn't quite felt over the phone. He looked like someone who didn't belong out there. Mid-30s, wiry frame, pale, skin like he hadn't seen the sun in months. Not unfit exactly, just unused, like a tool that hadn't been picked up in a while. He wore clothes that screamed city guy trying to look outdoorsy. Brand new hiking boots, technical jacket with the tags barely off, a backpack that probably cost more than my truck's last repair. But he was polite, respectful. He listened carefully during the safety walkthrough, didn't interrupt, didn't try to play the know-it-all. That alone set him apart from half the clients we get. Most folks either underestimate the wild or overestimate themselves. Chuck did neither. He asked thoughtful questions, mainly about weather, terrain, and wildlife. And when I told him I had final authority on safety decisions, he nodded like a man who understood chain of command. I liked that. Still, there was something distant about him. Not in a rude way, he wasn't cold, but he carried himself like someone whose thoughts were always half a mile away. During the gear check, I noticed how meticulous he was, rechecking every strap, every pocket, every item on his laminated packing list. Most clients don't even bring a list, let alone one with annotations in colored Sharpie. I chalked it up to nervousness or maybe just being the academic type. He told me he was a physicist, not the teaching kind, he clarified, the research kind. Worked at a university, specialized in something I couldn't even begin to pronounce. When he started describing his work, it sounded more like code or poetry than anything I'd ever heard. I don't pretend to understand quantum whatever the hell, but I could tell he was smart. Book smart anyway, not trail smart. What caught me off guard was how badly he wanted to reach a specific spot, this hilltop east of Fresno, near a peak we call Beartooth Mountain. He didn't just want to go there, he needed to. It was like a pilgrimage. Said he hadn't been since he was a kid, when his uncle used to take him camping. That was his reason for picking the spot. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, but Beartooth isn't exactly family-friendly terrain. There are a dozen easier, prettier, safer places for nostalgia. Places with picnic tables and bathrooms. Beartooth is the kind of location survivalists and loners go to be away from the world. I asked him casually, why there of all places? He gave me this vague answer about childhood memories, about how his uncle was a bit eccentric, but loved the solitude. But he didn't offer any specific stories. No warm reminiscing, no, my uncle and I used to build fires here, or this, one time we saw a bear. It was just vague, almost like he was reciting a cover story he'd memorized but didn't believe. Still, he was respectful, and that goes a long way with me. I didn't press. Some people keep things close to the chest, and out in the wild, privacy is a kind of currency. As long as he followed instructions and didn't pose a risk, I figured it didn't matter why he wanted to go. My job was to get him there and back. Safe. That's what I told myself anyway. But even then, before things went wrong, I felt a prickle of something I couldn't name. Not fear, not suspicion, just a quiet, gnawing tension. The kind that only gets louder the deeper you go. We set off early that morning, just after 6:30 a.m., heading out of Fresno and toward the eastern woodlands that cradled Beartooth Mountain like an old secret. The drive was quiet. Neither of us were in the mood to talk much, and I've never been one to force small talk. Chuck just stared out the window with that same far-off expression he'd had during the briefing, like his mind was already halfway up the trail. Once we arrived at the drop-off point, I parked the truck, geared us up, did the final checks, and we stepped into the trees. That first stretch was always the most jarring, leaving behind the dull hum of the truck engine and being swallowed whole by the forest silence. For some, it's peaceful, for others, unsettling. Chuck didn't flinch. We took it slow, 9 miles that first day. He kept pace better than I expected, considering his build and inexperience. He didn't complain, didn't stop to rest too often, and aside from a little wheezing near some of the steeper inclines, he handled the terrain with quiet determination. I started thinking maybe I'd misjudged him. Maybe the guy just needed to unplug. But as the hours passed, subtle things began to needle at me. His questions weren't the usual ones. Most clients ask about animals, weather patterns, survival skills. Chuck asked about magnetic interference, soil conductivity, satellite visibility. He kept glancing at the sky, muttering numbers under his breath. Once I caught him pressing something into the dirt, some kind of small sensor or scanner, then quickly stuffing it back into his bag when he saw me watching. He smiled like it was nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. It was late afternoon when I asked again, casually, why this mountain meant so much to him. He paused before answering, like he had to search for the script. "It's where my uncle taught me about the stars," he said. "We used to come out here to stargaze. Said the sky was clearest from Beartooth." It sounded harmless, almost sweet. But again, no follow-up. No story about a particular night, or a meteor shower, or getting lost and laughing by the fire. Just a sterile line. I let it drop, but something in his tone had shifted. Defensive, practiced. By the time we made camp that evening, the air was crisp and the woods were cloaked in a kind of stillness that city folks often mistake for peace. But I've been out, in the wild long enough to know that sometimes the quiet isn't calming. It's warning you. Chuck ate quietly, methodically, like every bite had been measured. Afterward, he unfolded a laminated printout, clearly a map of the area, but not any standard-issue topo or park ranger copy. This thing was dense, layered with notations in various colored inks, strange symbols, and what looked like math formulas scribbled in the margins. Some of it resembled star charts, others trig or maybe physics notations. There were 10 or 12 colored dots scattered across the area surrounding Beartooth, each one marked with a tiny letter or glyph. I leaned over, not too obviously, and asked, "What are the dots for?" Chuck didn't hesitate. "Places my uncle and I used to camp." It felt like a lie. I didn't say it, but I knew the terrain. Half the dots were nowhere near logical campsites, some were on near inaccessible ridges, and one, dead center, was precisely where we were headed. He liked to challenge us, Chuck added, as if sensing my doubt. Said the harder it was to reach a place, the more private the sky. That night, I sat by the fire long after he turned in. I kept glancing at his tent, thinking about that. Laminated map. Something about it gnawed at me. The symbols didn't just look academic, they looked ritualistic. Not in a religious sense, but like part of a pattern. A code. I didn't sleep much, just stared into the embers, listening for movement. Nothing came. No coyotes, no owls, just wind and the creak of trees. The next morning, Chuck was up before me, fully dressed, checking the map again. He looked wired, not tired, not groggy, keyed up like a kid on Christmas morning. As we hiked the second leg, he grew more animated the closer we got. He asked constantly how much farther, pointed out random trees and rocks with eerie familiarity, even though he hadn't been here since childhood. "It's just ahead," he kept saying. "I remember this bend or that outcrop." And maybe he did, but it felt more like he knew the layout, not remembered it. There's a difference. When we finally crested the last ridge and Beartooth came into view, sharp, jagged like a fang erupting from the forest floor, Chuck froze. Not in awe, not in joy, in reverence. I've guided people to all kinds of peaks, some cry, some cheer, some just collapse with relief. Chuck stood stock still, breathing hard, eyes wide like he was seeing a god. I watched him, expecting him to say something about his uncle, about a memory. Instead, he said nothing, just stared. I tried nudging conversation. "Looks familiar? Bring back good times?" But all I got were half-hearted nods and a mumbled, "Yeah, feels good to be back." We pressed on toward the base where he wanted to camp. As we reached the designated spot, marked clearly on his bizarre map, Chuck pulled out a GPS unit I hadn't seen before. He adjusted our position down to the exact coordinates, moving us a few meters to the right, then nodded with strange satisfaction. I helped set up camp, cooked, made small talk. He was calmer now, more centered, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like anticipation. He stayed up after I went to bed, saying he wanted to watch the sky. I didn't stop him. Clients are free to enjoy the night however they like, so long as they don't stray far. Before I zipped into my tent, I told him not to wander, and he gave me a salute. It wasn't mocking, it was solemn, like he was saying goodbye. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd led someone not just into the wilderness, but into some kind of destination. Not physical, psychological, or worse, something else entirely. The woods don't usually scare me, but that night they did. Because something was coming. I didn't know what yet, but it was out there. Or maybe it was already here. Sleeping 20 feet from me, under nylon, whispering equations to the stars. I woke up sometime after midnight to the soft, unmistakable sound of a tent zipper being undone. It's a noise that every wilderness guide knows intimately. Too soft to be threatening, too distinct to mistake. I sat up, blinked in the dark, ears on high alert. For a moment I thought maybe it was my own tent. Maybe the wind had caught the flap or I hadn't zipped it properly. But no, mine was sealed tight. The sound had come from a few feet away. Chuck's tent. Normally, hearing a client unzip. A tent in the dead of night doesn't warrant concern. Nature calls and there's no plumbing in the woods. Still, something about the timing, the silence that followed, it set my instincts humming. "Everything good, Chuck?" I called out, just loud enough to break the silence but not startle him if he was just answering the call of the wild. He responded almost immediately. "Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, man." But it wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. His voice was soft, calm, but there was something else layered beneath it, something final. It sounded thankful, sincere. Not the usual all good clients toss out when they're half asleep. This was different, like someone expressing appreciation right before boarding a one-way flight. I should have asked more, should have pressed, but I was groggy, and that calm tone lulled me into thinking everything was fine. I fell back asleep under a canopy of stars, lulled by the rustle of trees and the low crackle of what remained of the fire. When I opened my eyes again, morning had just begun to lighten the sky, washing the forest in a soft grey. As always, my first instinct was to check on the client. It's a habit burned into me. Accountability first thing in the morning. I got out of my tent, stretched, shook off the sleep and walked quietly toward Chuck's tent. It was zipped shut. I called his name once. No response. Twice. Still nothing. The third time I said it louder and waited. No movement inside. That's when I felt the first tremor of unease ripple through me. I knelt, called out again, then unzipped the tent. Empty. His sleeping bag was unrolled but untouched. His pack sat neatly to one side. No boots, no flashlight, nothing disturbed, just an empty tent and the lingering sense that something had shifted irreversibly during the night. I stepped out quickly and scanned the immediate area, hoping to see him a few yards off, relieving himself or maybe watching the sunrise. Nothing. I circled the camp, calling his name louder, the pitch of my voice rising each time. Still nothing. And then I saw them, about 50 yards downslope near a pair of leaning pine trees. A pile of clothes neatly stacked, folded even, boots on top, socks inside. Shirt, pants, even underwear placed carefully beneath them. No backpack, no water bottle, no gear. I froze. Something primal clutched at my stomach. I've seen a lot of strange things in the wild, but clothes, neatly folded clothes, with no sign of their owner, that's a bad sign. A really bad sign. It usually points to one of two things: disorientation due to hypothermia, or a sudden acute mental break. Either way, the stakes skyrocket. A naked man in the woods isn't just lost, he's in danger. I did what protocol demands. I activated the beacon on my satellite tracker, which immediately sent our coordinates and a distress signal. I radioed base, gave them the rundown, and initiated an emergency protocol, immediate area search with time-marked sweeps. But I knew I wasn't going to find him by just circling the campsite. The ground didn't give me much to work with. No clear footprints, no broken branches, and worst of all, no scent trail. Even the tracking dog the rangers later brought in couldn't hold his trail past a shallow stream just a quarter-mile from the site. According to the handlers, the scent just vanished, like Chuck had walked into that water and dissolved. The theory we came up with was chilling. Chuck had walked away during the early morning hours, fully aware of what he was doing. He left his gear, his clothes, even his socks, like he wanted to be hard to find, like he'd planned this. The dog tracked him down to the stream and lost the trail, which meant either he'd submerged himself to throw off the scent, or far worse, something else had happened. Something that didn't leave traces. By the time search and rescue arrived with drones and thermal imaging, I'd been questioned twice by park rangers and once by the local sheriff's deputy. Standard stuff, they said, but the way they asked. Certain things, the timing of the questions, the polite suspicion in their tone, I knew what they were doing. They were ruling me out as a suspect. I didn't blame them. I would have done the same. They asked what Chuck talked about. I told them physics, childhood, some uncle. Nothing threatening. They asked if he'd said anything strange before going to bed. I mentioned the thank you he gave me in the dark. The kind that didn't sound like a throwaway. That caught their attention. By nightfall, I was back at base camp. Chuck wasn't. The search stretched for weeks. Helicopters, search dogs, volunteers. Nothing. No body, no footprints, no gear dumped somewhere. Just that pile of clothes and a string of unanswered questions. Eventually, I was cleared. No charges, no negligence, but the guilt, that didn't go away. A guide's one job is to bring the client back alive, that's it. Doesn't matter if they're rude, weird, overambitious, or flat-out crazy. You bring them back. I didn't, and while I didn't know it yet, Chuck's disappearance wasn't an isolated event. He wasn't the first to vanish out near Beartooth, and he wouldn't be the last. But I'd been closer to it than anyone before, and somehow I'd been allowed to walk away. For now. The days that followed Chuck's disappearance moved like sludge, slow, thick, and saturated with dread. Search and rescue wasted no time. Within hours of my distress signal, they had boots on the ground, choppers in the sky, and K9 units sweeping the ridges. I stayed at the ranger outpost for the first 2 days, answering questions, reviewing the route, providing every single detail I could recall. How Chuck walked, where he stepped, what he said. Even the angle at which he'd placed his laminated map before bed. They took my GPS logs, combed through satellite logs, even checked footage from the body cam I wore clipped to my vest, standard issue for liability purposes. They saw what I saw. Chuck was calm, quiet, weird maybe, but not unstable, until he was gone. At first, the tone of the interviews was cooperative. They saw me as the last person to see him alive, and for a while, that just meant I was valuable. But then, sometime around day 3, things shifted. The questions turned colder, more pointed. Detectives came in, not just rangers or S&R coordinators, but homicide detectives. I recognized the signs. They weren't just gathering info anymore. They were building a timeline. A theory, one where I wasn't just the last person to see Chuck, but maybe the reason no one else ever would. I didn't take it personally at first. It's standard procedure. When a person goes missing in the wild, especially in a remote location, investigators start from the center and work their way out. I was the center, the only person within 20 miles of Chuck when he vanished. But it still felt like a gut punch when they asked me, straight-faced if we'd argued, if he'd ever seemed afraid of me, if I'd ever lost my temper. I wanted to shout at them, "You think I don't already feel responsible?" But I didn't. I stayed, calm. I gave them what they needed. I told them I had nothing to hide, and I didn't. but I also had no answers. What rattled everyone, what eventually turned the tide of suspicion away from me, was the forensic report on Chuck's clothes. They'd collected everything: the boots, the socks, the pants, the shirt, even the label from the inside of his jacket. And on every item they found no trace of DNA, not his, not anyone else's. It was as if the clothes had never been worn. No sweat, no oil, no skin cells, not even a stray hair. It defied logic. One of the forensic techs told me it looked like someone had deliberately cleaned them, scrubbed the items with a chemical solution, or soaked them in running water for hours. But these were field clothes made of absorbent technical fibers. Getting them that clean, that sterile in the wild, practically impossible, unless Chuck had planned it. The dogs picked up his scent from the camp to a nearby stream, then lost it completely. That's not uncommon. Water washes away trails. But the implication here was darker. The rangers believed he'd done it on purpose, that he'd walked into the stream not as a victim of disorientation, but as a man who knew what he was doing, that he'd wanted to vanish, either to fake his death or, worse, to find something he didn't intend to return from. Some of the search crew theorized mental illness, schizophrenia maybe, or undiagnosed trauma, but he'd passed our initial evaluation, no red flags, and besides, if he was sick, he was high-functioning, obsessively organized, disciplined. The way he moved, the way he talked, it wasn't chaos, it was intention. Every step of this had been measured, and that's what haunted me most, because if Chuck had planned this, then I had helped him. I'd driven him to the drop point. I'd led him into the woods. I'd watched him mark his exact coordinates with mathematical precision and unfold a map covered in symbols I didn't understand. I had taken him to his destination and then tucked myself into my tent and gone to sleep none the wiser. My boss gave me a week off, said I needed space to clear my head. I didn't argue. He closed the shop too. Out of respect for Chuck's family, he joined the volunteer search effort, even coordinated with the sheriff's department. But he didn't let me go back out there. Said it wasn't about guilt, it was about clarity. You're too close to it, he said. Too emotionally compromised. He was right. I spent those days back at home, walking circles around my apartment, rereading every word Chuck had written on his intake form. His handwriting was neat, almost mechanical. His emergency contact section was blank. I couldn't shake the questions. Why fold his clothes so neatly? Why clean them? Why wait until the second night? If he'd meant to disappear, why not go off trail on the first day? Why sleep at all? Some nights I'd wake up thinking I'd heard his voice, soft, measured, saying "thanks, man" in the dark. That phrase looped in my head like a curse, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Like he was grateful I'd brought him there. Like I'd been a key turning in a lock he'd designed long ago. I wasn't just his guide, I was part of his plan. And then came the kicker. Weeks later, after the official search was suspended, my boss told me about 2 other missing persons reports. Same region, similar circumstances. One from 3 years ago. One just the previous spring, both solo hikers, both male. Both vanished without a trace near Beartooth's perimeter. No remains, no gear, no notes. Just gone. They hadn't gotten media coverage the Park Service keeps. These things quiet to avoid panic and deter copycats. But internally, rangers had started whispering. Something was wrong with that mountain, and maybe that's what Chuck was chasing. Or escaping. Or becoming. The part that keeps me up at night isn't the mystery, it's the clarity. The certainty that I did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. The wild doesn't always kill with claws or cold. Sometimes it just opens a door and watches who walks through. Chuck didn't get lost, he found something, and I was the one who led him there. Story 2. A dream trip turned nightmare. If you knew Lana the way I did, you'd understand why this wasn't just a trip. It was a dream stitched together from screenshots, saved reels, and endless Pinterest boards. She'd been obsessed with northern British Columbia for years. Not the city parts, not Vancouver or Victoria, or anywhere people actually live, but the untouched parts, the kind of places you only reach by seaplane or pure determination. Her fixation zeroed in on a single place, a mountain the locals called the Cathedral. Just below its peak sat a high-altitude lake, still and electric blue, surrounded by a flat, grassy shelf that looked like it had been carved out by the hands of old gods. She'd seen a photo of it once, just one, and it had never left her. That picture was her phone background for the better part of a year, and when she finally changed it, it was only to swap in another angle of the same damn mountain. It wasn't that Lana was some hardcore hiker or anything, quite the opposite. She wasn't lazy, but she wasn't into sweating for fun either. She just felt something about that place, like it was sacred to her in a way she couldn't explain. Every time she talked about it, her voice softened, her words slowed. She'd say stuff like, "I know it sounds dumb, but I feel like I belong there." Of course it didn't sound dumb. Not to me. When you've been best friends with someone since middle school, through every boyfriend disaster, every family implosion, every late-night panic spiral, you learn to take those feelings seriously. So I made a decision. If she couldn't get there herself, I'd take her. I spent months planning, saving, scheming. Lana's birthday was coming up and I told her we were going to Cancun. It was the perfect cover. Warm clothes wouldn't be needed until they were. I made sure she had a passport, booked the real flights, found the seaplane service, and contacted a small wilderness tour company that offered guided hikes in the Atlin Provincial Park. They even had connections to a private guide who could lead us straight to the cathedral's base without the usual bureaucracy. It wasn't cheap, but I didn't care. This wasn't a vacation, it was a gesture, a thank you for a lifetime of showing up for me. On the morning of our flight, I handed her the real itinerary. We weren't going south to sunbathe. We were heading north to one of the most remote corners of the continent. I'll never forget her face. There was this moment where she just stared at the papers in her hands, not moving, not breathing. Then she looked up at me, and her eyes were already welling. "You're kidding," she said, laughing through the tears. "You're actually insane." I shrugged. "You said you'd never make it there. I figured I'd prove you wrong." We repacked in a frenzy, warm gear instead of bikinis, and by nightfall we were on a flight to Vancouver, then Port Hardy, then a tin can seaplane that buzzed over endless mountains and ice fields before touching down on a glassy lake beside a pine-covered island called Peggy's. I'll be honest, the ride was terrifying. But Lana was glowing. She sat by the window, forehead pressed to the glass, watching her dream unfold in real time. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd done something right. I didn't know what was waiting for us up there. I didn't know that what started as a gift would become something else entirely, something I'd regret for the rest of my life. We met Charles the morning after we arrived on Peggy's Island. The tour company had a small base camp set up near the dock, just a few cabins, some gear sheds, and a central fire pit surrounded by weathered benches. When he walked up to introduce himself, it felt like he'd stepped straight out of a travel brochure. Mid to late 20s, tall, broad shoulders, olive-toned skin that said he'd spent years in the sun. His dark hair was pulled back in a neat knot, and his beard was perfectly trimmed, rugged but intentional. And his eyes, God, those eyes, deep brown and steady, like someone who had seen storms and survived them. He wore a fitted ranger-style uniform, the kind that somehow made him look both official and like he belonged on the cover of an outdoor magazine. Lana nudged me the moment she saw him. I didn't have to look at her to know she was smirking. Charles introduced himself with a firm handshake and a quiet confidence that immediately put us at ease. "I'll be your guide for the cathedral hike," he said, flashing a smile that didn't feel rehearsed. "We'll move at your pace, stop when you need, and I'll handle the hard parts. Your only job is to enjoy the view." He had a calm, reassuring energy, like nothing could rattle him. Not the weather, not the terrain, not even a couple of city girls fumbling their way up a mountain. We followed him to the gear station, where he helped us double-check our packs. Water, snacks, extra layers, waterproof gear, bear spray. He didn't mock us when we came up short or packed the wrong stuff. Instead, he made quiet adjustments, swapped out what we needed, and never once made us feel like tourists pretending to be tough. That afternoon, after the gear check, we sat down with him near the fire pit, and he walked us through the next day's plan. "We'll take the boat across the lake," he said, using a stick to sketch a rough map in the dirt. "From there, we'll hike up to the plateau. That's where the lake sits, your cathedral. If you're feeling strong, we can climb a little higher for a view of the valley on the other side. But it's your call, I'm just here to help you get there." His voice was smooth and quiet, like water over stone. He had that rare quality where every word he spoke felt measured and meaningful, never wasted. Lana hung on his every word. Not just because he was easy on the eyes, but because he radiated safety. You felt like you could trust him. I felt it too. After the briefing, we went back to our tent and Lana collapsed into her sleeping bag, grinning like a kid on Christmas Eve. "I think he's the most beautiful man I've ever seen," she whispered dramatically. "And I'm not just saying that because he's carrying my backpack tomorrow." I laughed and rolled my eyes, but I wasn't far behind her in admiration. Charles was like a real-life wilderness prince, strong, patient, impossibly composed. We felt lucky, blessed even. I remember saying, half joking, we hit the jackpot, and we believed that. We believed we were in the best hands possible. What we didn't know, what we couldn't know, was that the man who smiled so easily, who moved like a shadow through the forest, was carrying something inside him far heavier than any backpack, something waiting to break loose. The morning of the hike started perfectly. We met Charles at sunrise, the air still cool and sharp with the scent of pine and lake mist. He greeted us with that same easy smile, handed us each a cup of hot tea, brewed over a small fire, and helped us load into the boat. The lake was glassy, reflecting the jagged peaks like a painting, and the only sound was the soft churn of the engine and the occasional call of a loon in the distance. Charles pointed out landmarks as we glided across, sharing small bits of local lore, names of mountains, old logging routes, stories about wolves seen at twilight. Lana sat near the bow, eyes wide, soaking it all in. She didn't say much, and neither did I. It felt almost sacred, like speaking too loud would shatter the perfection of that moment. When we reached the far shore and stepped onto land, the terrain rose quickly. Dense brush, switchbacks, and uneven trails, but Charles led the way with unshakable grace, helping us over fallen logs, offering his hand when the incline sharpened. For the first few hours he was everything a guide should be, attentive, patient, quietly encouraging, but somewhere along the climb, something in him began to shift. It was subtle at first. We paused for water and he checked his radio. Nothing unusual there. He'd been checking in with the tour center periodically since we left the dock, but this time his tone was different. He turned slightly away from us, shoulders hunched, voice low and clipped. When he turned back, he wore the same polite smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. They looked off tighter, like something had agitated him. Still we pressed on. The climb grew steeper, and the trees thinned out into patches of scrub and wildflower meadows. The sun was climbing too, casting long shadows that flickered between us as we hiked. Lana was starting to get winded, but she pushed forward with quiet determination, knowing what was waiting at the top. When we finally crested the final rise and stepped onto the plateau, she gasped, and for good reason. The view was everything she'd dreamed of. The lake shimmered with that surreal icy blue. The cathedral peak towered above us, jagged and ancient, cutting into the sky like a blade. Lana dropped her pack and just stood there, arms slack at, her sides tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't believe I'm here," she whispered. Charles stood a few feet away watching her. He didn't smile. He didn't say a word, just watched. I chalked it up to fatigue or maybe just giving her a private moment, but I couldn't ignore the way his expression had hardened. Not cold, not angry, just vacant. We spent the next 20 minutes taking photos, laughing, basking in the strange magic of that place. It was everything I'd hoped the trip would be, until Charles broke the spell. He checked his radio again. This time, we heard the static. We saw his hand tremble, slightly, as he brought the receiver to his mouth. He responded with only a few words, "Copy that," before clipping it back onto his belt. Then he turned to us and said flatly, "We need to end the hike early. Pack up. We froze." "Wait, what?" I asked. "Why? We just got here." His face remained unreadable. "It's not safe to continue. I've made the decision. We're heading back now." The change in him was jarring. The calm, charming guide from just hours ago was gone, replaced by someone sharp-edged and curt. "Is there a storm coming?" Lana asked, concern creeping into her voice. "Because if it's just wind or something, we can manage." Charles cut her off. "Don't question my decisions." His voice wasn't raised, but it was forceful. Final. The kind of tone you use when you've already lost your patience. Lana and I exchanged a glance. Something was wrong. Really wrong. I took a step closer to him. "Look, if there's a real risk, you can tell us. We're not going to argue, but we deserve to know what's going on." Charles stared at me for a long second, jaw clenched, as if debating something internally. Then he turned away without a word and started walking fast, not hiking, not leading, just leaving. We scrambled to grab our packs and follow, suddenly scrambling to keep pace with the man who'd spent the whole morning encouraging us to move slowly and mind our footing. We called after him, asked him to slow down, but he didn't respond. His long strides cut through the trail with surgical focus, and he was gaining distance fast. Within minutes, he was 50 feet ahead, then 100. Panic started to rise in my chest. Lana whispered, "Is he going to leave us here?" And the horrifying truth was, I didn't know. I shouted his name, no response. He just kept moving, nearly jogging now, brushing past branches and loose rocks like they weren't even there. And then, just when we thought he was gone for good, he stopped, dead in his tracks, and began pacing, not walking, pacing, back and forth in a tight, agitated circle, muttering to himself under his breath. Fists clenched, shoulders tight. Every few seconds he'd let out a frustrated growl or punch the air. We approached cautiously, and that's when he turned to us and snapped, really snapped. His words were a mess of accusations and anger. "No one listens. No one ever listens," he shouted. "Why should I explain myself? You think this is about you?" Lana took a step back. I tried to calm him, to talk him down, but it was like trying to reason with a storm. There was something breaking inside him, something we'd never seen coming, and it was only beginning. Charles didn't just have a moment, he fractured. Right there on the trail, just below the plateau, with the wind tossing pine needles around us, and the lake behind us glowing like an eye. It was like watching a statue crack from the inside, like something had been holding him together just barely, and now it had collapsed. He paced erratically, muttering, ranting, swinging his arms like he was arguing with ghosts. Every now and then he turned toward us, his eyes wild, lips curled, and said things we couldn't fully make out. Fragments, like you never understand and always have to control everything, burst out between garbled growls. Lana was shaking. I was too. All the calm, safety and control he'd projected the day before was gone, shattered in a heartbeat. It was terrifying, not just because of what he was doing, but because of where we were. We were on a mountainside, in northern British Columbia with no cell signal, no GPS, no map. And the one person who knew the terrain had just mentally checked out of reality. I did what instinct told me to. I started apologizing, repeatedly, quietly. I didn't even know what I was apologizing for, but I said I was sorry, that we didn't mean to upset him, that we just wanted to go back safely. Lana joined in, her voice brittle, trying to reason with him. "Charles, we're sorry, we didn't mean to push you, just please help us get back." He didn't answer, he just started marching again down the trail, fast and furious like before. We followed. We didn't have a choice. The forest was too dense, the path too winding. Without him, we were gone. Every time we called his name, he ignored us. When we begged him to slow down, he barked, "Keep up," over his shoulder, but never turned around. His body moved like a machine, rigid, mechanical, filled with an energy that felt like it was burning from the inside out. It took nearly an hour of this panicked descent before we finally reached the lake's edge again. The sky was growing, overcast, and the air had that weird pressure that builds before a storm. The dock creaked under our boots as Charles leapt into the boat, fired the ignition, and shouted at us to get in. We hesitated for a second, but there was nowhere else to go. If we stayed, we'd be alone in the woods. If we followed, we'd be at his mercy. We chose the boat. We sat at the back while he manned the motor, silent at first. Then the storm. Inside him started to leak back out. He muttered to himself as he steered. Angry, disconnected thoughts, names, accusations. Occasionally he'd yell something loud and sudden, nonsense syllables or half-formed sentences that seemed torn straight from an argument no one else could hear. "I told you not to," he'd shout. "You made this worse." Then silence, then laughter. Not happy laughter, nervous, breathless, jagged. Lana clutched my hand so hard, her nails dug into my palm. I whispered to her, "Don't say anything. Don't move unless you have to." I didn't even realize I was crying until my voice caught in my throat. The wind had picked up. The water was choppy now, and Charles, either out of spite or sheer oblivion, started pushing the boat faster than I thought possible for a vessel that size. We bounced violently over the swells, every crash making my teeth rattle. We screamed at him to slow down. He didn't even flinch. "It doesn't matter anymore," he screamed into the wind. "None of it matters." Then he stopped, mid-lake, just killed the engine and let the boat drift. The silence that followed was horrifying. Charles stood at the front, hands gripping the edge, his chest heaving. Then he turned and looked at us, really looked at us. His face was flushed, his pupils wide and glassy. And in that moment, I genuinely believed he was deciding whether or not to kill us. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened. I could see it, this war going on inside him, some monstrous angry thing roaring at him from the back of his mind, while some thin thread of humanity tried to hold it back. We sat frozen, helpless. Lana whimpered, barely audible, "Please don't." That's what did it. That tiny, trembling plea. It hit him like a bell. His shoulders slumped, his eyes closed. He turned back to the controls and restarted the engine, without a word. The ride back was in silence. A terrifying, heavy silence. Charles drove at a reasonable pace now, navigating the water with mechanical focus. We didn't speak. We didn't even breathe too loud. We just stared at the rippling water and counted the seconds until our feet touched land again. When we reached the dock, Charles didn't wait for the boat to fully bump into place. He jumped. out and began tying it off like nothing had happened. Lana scrambled out first, practically falling onto the dock. I followed, legs weak, heart still thundering. I should have walked away. I should have grabbed Lana and run straight for the tent or the main office. But something inside me cracked open. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was rage. I turned to Charles, who was still messing with the ropes, and I snapped. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I shouted. "You think you can treat people like that? You're unstable. You need help. You're done." He turned slowly, calmly, and then lunged. His hand was around my throat before I could take a step back. One motion. That's all it took. He was strong, so much stronger than I expected. His grip tightened, and suddenly the world narrowed into a dark, soundless tunnel. My knees buckled. My hands clawed at his wrist. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could see were his eyes, wide, unblinking, filled with something far beyond rage. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to end me. I remember thinking in that split second before the shadows closed in, this is how I die. Here, on a dock, by the hands of someone I trusted, then shouting. Footsteps, another voice yelling, "Hey!" and hands pulling him back. He didn't fight it. He just released me suddenly, like he realized he'd gone too far or like the rage had finally burned itself out. I fell to the dock, coughing, gasping, my vision swimming. Charles stumbled back, arms raised, muttering, I'm fine, I didn't mean..." But it was too late. People had seen. Someone had already run off toward the office. Two other guides held Charles by the arms and began walking him away. He didn't resist. Lana dropped beside me, sobbing. I pulled her close. The camp was buzzing now, people talking, asking what happened, why Charles had snapped. I tried to explain, but could barely form words. We were eventually taken to the main office, where the owner, an older woman with silver hair and a lined, weather-beaten face, sat us down with warm drinks and asked for the whole story. We told her everything, from the mountain to the lake to the moment his hands closed around my neck. She listened, nodded grimly, and finally said, "His wife called the moment you reached the top. She didn't ask to speak to him, just wanted to pass on a message. Said she caught him cheating again, said she's taking the kids, said he'll never see them again." I stared at her, stunned. "And you told him? In the middle of a guided hike?" She looked away, guilt flickering in her eyes. "I thought he'd want to know. I didn't think he'd snap." We could have sued, probably should have, but we didn't. They fired him immediately, refunded the trip, and offered to fly us back that same day. None of it felt like enough. Nothing would. The trip that had been Lana's dream had become a waking nightmare, and I had been the one who gave it to her, wrapped in ribbons and booked in advance. A perfect gift, delivered by a monster I'd mistaken for a guide. The boat ride back should have felt like an escape, but it didn't. Even with Charles gone, escorted away by two of his co-workers, his eyes glassy and distant as they led him into one of the back cabins, there was no sense of safety, no relief washing over us, only numbness. Lana and I sat at the edge of the main dock, wrapped in borrowed fleece blankets, sipping something warm we couldn't taste. The camp staff buzzed quietly around us, like emergency workers cleaning up after a natural disaster. People glanced at us, spoke in hushed tones, and avoided asking anything directly. Eventually, the head of the tour company came to us, apologized again, and confirmed what we already knew. Charles had been fired on the spot. "He won't work in this field again," she said, and her voice sounded both certain and terrified. She told us the company would cover our return flight, refund the trip in full, and even pay for therapy if we needed it. But none of that touched the weight in my chest, the cold, sharp guilt that had settled like a stone. Because I had done this. I had made this happen. Lana didn't say that, not once. In fact, she went out of her way to absolve me. "You couldn't have known," she whispered that night, after we'd gotten back to the hotel in Vancouver. He wasn't like that when we met him. You were trying to do something kind. But that didn't help, not really, because I had chosen this. I'd picked the destination. I'd selected the guide. I'd orchestrated every detail of the trip, right down to hiding the truth from her until we boarded the plane. I'd wanted to give her a memory. Instead, I gave her a trauma she'll carry forever. The days after we returned blurred together. Lana tried to push past it, to bury herself in normalcy. Work, errands, short texts that didn't mention the word mountain. I tried to do the same, but I'd wake up at night with the sensation of fingers tightening around my neck, gasping. In the dark. Sometimes I'd hear Charles's voice in my head, not yelling but calm from earlier, when he promised us it would be a safe and beautiful hike. And it wasn't just nightmares. It was that slow erosion of trust, the way I'd begun to look sideways at people I'd otherwise welcome. A waiter who smiled too long, a man at the gas station with twitchy hands. I didn't trust anyone for a while, because Charles had seemed perfect, calm, strong, reliable. He'd carried our bags and complimented our gear. He'd told us stories about glacial formation and wolf migrations. And in one conversation, one single radio message, he unraveled so violently that I thought he might kill us both. That's what stuck. Not just the fear, but the fact that it had all come from nowhere. No warning, no signs, just one moment of stillness, and then fire. I didn't pursue legal action, not because I didn't have grounds, but because I didn't want to turn something so personal into something public. The company had handled it well. At least once it happened. But what haunted me more than the company's mistake, more than the message relayed mid-hike, was the thought that he might have done this anyway. That the rage was always there. That if it hadn't been that message, it could have been anything. A stubbed toe, a change in weather, a comment he didn't like, and we'd still have been alone with him, high on that mountain, with no one but trees and cold air to witness what he became. I still think about that sometimes. What would have happened if he hadn't stopped himself in the boat? If Lana hadn't whispered, "Please don't," in just the right way? That moment became a hinge in my memory, a door that could have swung toward death. But it didn't. We came back. We survived. And survival, I've learned, doesn't always come with peace. Sometimes it just means you get to live with the questions. Story 3. The Cannibal Guide. Alfred G. Packer was born in Pennsylvania in 1842, but any truths about his early life end about there. Nearly everything else about the man, his accomplishments, his hardships, even his motivations, were tangled in exaggeration, contradiction, or outright lies. He grew up in Indiana after his family moved west during his childhood, and by most accounts, his early years were marked by isolation and instability. Those who knew him described him as moody, argumentative, and a compulsive storyteller. Not the kind who entertained either, the kind who twisted facts so regularly that even he seemed unsure what the truth was anymore. He left home young, around age 16 or 17, leaving a note that simply read, "Never coming back." From there, his life drifted in and out of rail towns, mining camps, and frontier settlements like wind through a broken door. He worked odd jobs, shoemaker, ranch hand, wagon driver, and claimed to have prospected for gold in nearly every western state. What he really did, more often than not, was wander from one employer to the next, stirring resentment along the way. People who hired him found him lazy, unreliable, and worst of all, a thief. He had a reputation for pilfering supplies, sneaking rations, and inventing excuses faster than most men could speak. Yet somehow, he always landed on his feet. He had the gift of persuasion. If you didn't know better, you'd almost call him charismatic. During the Civil War, Packer enlisted with the Union Army, But even there he couldn't hold it together. He was discharged after less than a year due to epilepsy, though some suspected he faked symptoms to avoid combat. When the war ended, he joined the wave of fortune hunters pushing deeper into the West, lured by the dream of gold buried under the mountains and pine forests of Colorado, Utah, and the Dakota territories. Packer wasn't a miner. He barely knew how to hold a pickaxe, let alone read terrain. But that didn't stop him from claiming he was a seasoned prospector. Wherever he went, he introduced himself as a wilderness guide, a man who could lead settlers and treasure seekers safely through the harsh frontier. In truth, he'd gotten more than one wagon train hopelessly lost, sometimes costing them weeks or even their lives. Still, he spoke with conviction. He knew just enough lingo to sound credible, just enough confidence to bluff his way through every new introduction. He convinced desperate men to put their lives in his hands again and again. In the early 1870s, there were no background checks, no one to cross-reference your stories. If you could stand tall, speak fast, and flash a trustworthy smile, you could pass for anything. And Packer did. He passed for a guide, for a leader, even for a friend. But behind that leathery frontier face was a man whose loyalty extended only as far as his next meal. And soon that hunger, literal or otherwise, would become the most defining part of his name. In November of 1873, Alfred Packer found himself in Provo, Utah, surrounded by a group of 20 gold-hungry men on the verge of making a deadly decision. They called themselves prospectors, but most of them were more like dreamers, each chasing the fantasy of striking it rich in the uncharted San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado. The group was led by a man named Robert McGrew, and by the time they reached Provo, winter was already creeping down the peaks, dusting the trails with frost and threatening to close the passes entirely. They needed a guide, someone who knew the route, who had seen the mountains and lived to talk about it. Enter Alfred Packer, 31 years old and full of fire. When asked, he claimed he was 23. He told them he'd been through the San Juans dozens of times, that he knew the mining territory around Breckenridge and could get them there safely for a modest fee. He said the route he had in mind was direct, efficient and easily passable even in winter. He was convincing, charming even, and in the face of urgency, the men didn't dig too deep. For $25 a head, they hired him on the spot. That's how Packer became the man tasked with guiding them through some of the deadliest terrain in the Rocky Mountains. And he was completely, utterly unqualified. The journey began with good spirits, but trouble arrived early. Even before they reached the Colorado line, it became painfully obvious that Packer had oversold his abilities. He was clumsy with maps, misjudged distances, and often seemed confused about the path ahead. He argued frequently with McGrew and several others, especially when delays stretched into days and rations began to dwindle. The weather worsened. Heavy snow began to fall, trails disappeared beneath drifts. Horses grew weak from hunger and cold, eventually collapsing and dying. When the men began to eat the horse feed, it was clear they were entering a new stage of desperation, morale shattered. There were whispers of mutiny, of abandoning Packer in the mountains, but they were already lost, and by then, even a bad guide seemed better than none at all. Just as everything was unraveling, the group stumbled, almost miraculously, upon the winter encampment of Chief Ouray and the Ute people. The chief, known as the white man's friend, offered them food, shelter, and an urgent warning. Do not proceed through the mountains, not in winter. The passes were treacherous, the storms unpredictable. He begged them to wait until spring and promised safety if they stayed. 9 men took his advice and stayed behind. 11, including Packer, chose to keep going. It was a gamble they wouldn't survive. Packer split off with 5 others: Frank Butcher Miller, Shannon Bell, George California Noon, James Humphrey, and Israel Swan. They followed what Packer claimed was a shortcut, bypassing the safer, longer route suggested by Chief Ure. It wasn't long before the snow deepened, and the cold became suffocating. The trail vanished under feet of powder. They were forced to abandon their gear-laden horses and shoulder whatever supplies they could carry. Food ran out quickly. Hunger set in like a second skin. The men began to suffer visibly, shivering, constantly hallucinating, dragging their feet in slow agony. And still, Packer insisted they were close. Days passed, then weeks. No sign of Breckenridge, no sign of life. Then, in April of 1874, a gaunt, half-starved figure stumbled out of the woods near the Los Pinos Indian Agency in Colorado. He was filthy, exhausted, and carrying a rifle, a knife, and a small satchel. It was Alfred Packer. He claimed he was the lone survivor of a tragedy. He told the agents he'd gone snowblind and been left behind by the others, who had taken the remaining food and struck off without him. He said he wandered alone through the wilderness, living on roots, bark, and shoe leather. He wept while telling it, pale and shaking. People believed him at first. The man looked like hell, and the wilderness was known to be unforgiving. The Awadi agents gave him food, water, a bed. They even bought his rifle off him for a decent sum out of sympathy. But not everyone was convinced. Something was off. For a man who'd supposedly been starving for weeks, Packer looked oddly healthy, bloated in the face even. And then there was the spending. He bought himself a horse, fancy clothes, good whiskey, and booked the nicest room in the nearby saloon. He spent like a man who had discovered gold, but he had no gold to show. When some of the other men from McGrew's group, those who'd stayed with Chief Ure, ran into him at the saloon, they were shocked and suspicious. Where were the others? Why was Packer wearing Frank Miller's knife, the same knife Miller had never parted with? And how had a man abandoned in the mountains come back with more money than when he left? Preston Nutter, one of McGrew's men, confronted Packer directly. He didn't buy a word of his story, nor did General Charles Adams, who ran the Indian Agency. Adams had Packer detained for questioning. Under pressure, Packer's story began to shift. He now claimed that the others had died slowly, one after the other, succumbing to cold and starvation, and that the surviving men had no choice but to eat the bodies to stay alive. He admitted to cannibalism, but only as a last resort. Only as a victim of circumstance. He didn't kill anyone, he insisted. He just survived. Barely. But even that story didn't hold, because when a hunting party later found the campsite deep in the San Juans, what would soon be called Dead Man's Gulch, they found the truth carved into the snow. The bodies of the 5 men were there, all of them mutilated, their heads bashed in, their limbs butchered, their bones stripped of muscle like deer carcasses. All 5 men had died in the same place, not over time, not separately, together, violently, and only one man had walked away, with a full stomach and a pocket full of their money. His name was Alfred Packer, and the world was about to learn what he'd truly done in those frozen woods. When General Charles Adams brought Alfred Packer in for formal questioning, the tension in the room was so thick it felt like you could chew on it. The man who had stumbled into civilization looking like a half-drowned survivor was now clean-shaven, better fed, and visibly defensive. His hands twitched when he spoke. He sweated even in the cool cabin. At first, Packer stuck to his revised story. The 5 men had succumbed one by one to the unforgiving winter, and as the last living member of the group, he'd eaten from their bodies out of desperation. He described it with the gravity of a man forced to commit the unthinkable. He wept, or at least pretended to. He spoke of sleepless nights, freezing temperatures, and the agony of deciding whether to starve or desecrate the dead. But Adams had spent years dealing with frontier survivors, real ones, and something about Packer didn't add up. The emotional notes of his testimony felt hollow, rehearsed. Worse, his version of the sequence when each man died, where, how, kept changing ever so slightly. In one version, it was Swan who died first. In another, Humphrey. He couldn't keep it straight. Adams had heard lies before, but this was a liar flailing. Too many moving parts, too many details, and no backbone of truth holding it together. Things began to unravel quickly. Packer claimed that after one man died of exposure, the rest reluctantly agreed to eat him. Then, as they moved forward, another died, and the cycle repeated. But then came a detail he hadn't meant to reveal. He described eating from a man's leg while it was still warm. That single slip altered the tone of the entire interview. Adams paused. The room went silent. "You said he died in his sleep," Adams remarked. "So when exactly was his leg still warm?" Packer froze. His face went pale. He backpedaled, tried to amend the statement, but it was too late. Adams dismissed him for the day and sent word to assemble a search party. If Packer's story was true, there would be evidence: graves, scattered campsites, the slow progression of bodies left behind in the snow. But when the scouts arrived in the place Packer had indicated, what they found was something entirely different. All 5 bodies were there, all of them together, all of them violently butchered. One by one, they'd been slain in the same spot. The camp was a slaughterhouse, not a sequence of tragedies. No one had wandered off. No one had died gently. They'd been killed and cannibalized. When Adams confronted Packer with the findings, the former guide fell apart. His third version of the story came pouring out like a dam breaking. This time he claimed he had left the group to search for firewood and returned to find Shannon Bell, wild-eyed, blood-soaked, standing over the bodies of their comrades. According to Packer, Bell had gone mad and murdered the rest. When Bell tried to kill him too, Packer said he shot him in self-defense, then used Bell's hatchet to finish the job. Left alone, terrified and starving, he claimed he had no choice but to eat the remains. But no one believed this version either. The forensic state of the bodies didn't match the tale. Bell's skull had been split cleanly from behind, not in the front or side as if he'd been charging someone. Furthermore, Bell's corpse showed signs of being butchered with the same precision as the others, flesh stripped from the bones methodically. If Bell had gone berserk, when had Packer taken the time to carve him like livestock? The contradictions mounted. Witnesses from town came forward and said Packer hadn't seemed traumatized when he first arrived. He'd seemed elated, even smug. He'd bragged about surviving alone. He'd spent money like he'd won it in a poker game. Worse yet, he'd been seen with multiple wallets, some of which matched those carried by the deceased. When pressed, Packer claimed he had taken the wallets only to document the deaths and eventually return them to family members. That might have held water if he hadn't emptied them and used the cash to buy whiskey and a new pair of boots. By then, Adams knew what he was looking at. This wasn't a desperate man who had done the unthinkable to survive. This was a predator who had used winter as his weapon. The press caught wind, and the story exploded. Headlines declared Packer the Colorado Cannibal. Rumors flew, some true, others sensationalized. One article claimed he ate his victims alive. Another said he salted their flesh to make it last longer. But even without the embellishments, the truth was bad enough. 5 men, all in good health when they left, all found hacked to pieces. And Packer, the only one who made it back, couldn't keep his story straight. The case went to trial, and public interest was so intense the courtroom had to limit seating. Packer pleaded not guilty, of course. His defense claimed he'd only done what he needed to do, that he was not a killer, only a survivor. But the prosecution painted a far different picture. They laid out the evidence, the possessions found on Packer, The condition of the bodies, the witnesses who'd seen him spend with impunity. Most damning of all, they highlighted his pattern of deception, the way his stories evolved, contradicting themselves, always reshaping to serve his needs. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Alfred Packer guilty of premeditated murder. The judge, reportedly disgusted, sentenced him to death by hanging. There were 7 Democrats in Hinsdale County, he said, and you man-eating son of a bitch, you ate 5 of them. It was gallows humor in the darkest form, but the crowd laughed anyway. Justice had been served, or so it seemed. In a twist almost as absurd as the crime itself, Packer's execution was overturned due to a technicality, something about the laws at the time not being retroactive. A retrial was held years later, and Packer was instead sentenced to 40 years in prison, one of the longest sentences in US history up to that point. But the damage was already done. The myth of Alfred Packer was cemented. Whether he was a cold-blooded killer or a man broken by hunger, no one could ever say for certain. And that uncertainty, that chilling ambiguity, left a scar across the frontier that never truly healed. Because in the heart of the Rockies, among the ice and pine, one man made a decision. He could guide his friends through the mountains, or he could feed on them. And somewhere in that blizzard, Alfred Packer chose the latter. The truth came spilling out of the snow in August 1874, months after Alfred Packer's first confession, and long after most had given up hope of ever finding the bodies. It was a young illustrator from Harper's Weekly, John A. Randolph, who made the grisly discovery. He had been hiking near Slumgullion Pass, a narrow strip of treacherous trail just southeast of Lake City, Colorado, when he stumbled upon a clearing that reeked of rot even months after the spring thaw. Drawn by the scent and something primal, in the stillness of the trees, he approached a depression in the earth and saw what could only be described as a mass grave, open and exposed, surrounded by pine and hemlock. 5 bodies lay in various states of decay, their limbs splayed unnaturally, skulls cracked wide like melons dropped from a roof. Randolph was no lawman, no medical expert, but even he could tell this wasn't a campsite where men had perished from cold and starvation. This was a slaughter ground. The corpses were not scattered across a trail as Packer had claimed. They were all in one place, barely yards from one another, and they hadn't died from exposure. They died from violence, blunt force trauma to the head, precise and repeated blows, the kind that spoke not of desperation, but of intention. When word reached the Hinsdale County Sheriff, he assembled a team of deputies, rangers, and volunteers to descend upon the site with spades and caution. They arrived to find the scene exactly as Randolph had sketched it. Frank Butcher Miller's body was almost entirely skeletonized, stripped of muscle and tissue, with his bones bearing knife marks, clean, practiced cuts that mirrored butchering work done in slaughterhouses. George Noon and James Humphrey were more intact but similarly violated. Their legs had been removed at the joints, ribs peeled open, and portions of their thighs carved away with disturbing precision. Israel Swan, the oldest of the men and the one thought to have carried the most money, was dismembered from the waist down, his torso hacked open, his organs missing or long decayed. But it was Shannon Bell who told the real story. Bell's corpse was the freshest, relatively speaking. His skin was sloughing off, but his position was frozen in a kind of final agony. Arms extended, mouth open, eyes half-lidded in death. Most disturbingly, the top of his skull had been cleanly split and the brain removed entirely. Nearby, searchers found bone fragments scorched by fire, suggesting that parts of the men had been cooked and consumed right there, in that cursed patch of earth. There was no evidence of burial, no attempt to preserve dignity. These weren't comrades laid to rest, they were carcasses, harvested like game. The investigators recorded everything, taking notes, drawing diagrams, collecting what remained of the personal items scattered through the brush. Among the detritus, a belt buckle engraved with initials, half a charred leather boot, a rusted tin cup, and the unmistakable handle of Frank Miller's prized skinning knife, cleaned and sharpened, still glinting dully in the late summer light. But the story the bodies told spoke louder than any confession. This wasn't survival cannibalism. There was no desperation in the scene, only calculated dismemberment. If the men had died over time, there would have been multiple campsites, signs of progression, traces of movement. Instead, it appeared they'd all been killed in the same place, likely around the same time, and the brutality of their injuries suggested they hadn't gone willingly. This wasn't a man fending off madness in the cold. This was methodical killing, followed by methodical carving. The report made its way back to General Adams and the local authorities. If anyone still harbored doubts about Packer's guilt, they were obliterated by the forensics. Even by 19th century standards, the implications were undeniable. Adams had the site cordoned off, and townspeople soon began calling the place Dead Man's Gulch. It became a grim landmark, a scar on the land that even the most hardened trappers refused to camp near. Stories spread quickly, growing in grotesquerie, with each telling, but the facts held firm. 5 men entered the wilderness with Alfred Packer. Only Packer returned, and now the bodies had been found, mutilated, arranged, consumed. The physical evidence didn't just contradict Packer's versions of events, it demolished them. Each body was a rebuttal to his lies. When news reached Lake City that the corpses had been found, a new kind of fury swept through the town. Locals who had once pitied Packer now wanted blood. He was still being held in a makeshift jail, little more than a log cabin with a bolted door on the outskirts of town, because authorities feared a lynch mob if he were housed in the sheriff's office. But by the time deputies arrived to formally charge him with murder, Packer was gone, vanished. Someone no one ever confessed had unlocked the door and let him slip into the night. Whether it was a sympathizer, a bribed official, or a well-meaning fool who believed his tales of survival, Packer had escaped justice. For now. But even in his absence, the mountain had spoken. The trees had remembered, and the snow had melted, just long enough to reveal what truly happened on that doomed expedition. The bodies told a story that no man could talk his way out of, and Alfred Packer, the guide, the liar, the survivor, was no longer just a man with a mystery. He was a wanted killer. And the hunt had begun. When Alfred Packer was finally recaptured in 1883, nearly 9 years after his escape from that crude log cabin jail, he didn't return to public scrutiny as a criminal caught in flight. He re-entered the world as a spectacle. By then, his name had traveled across the American frontier, becoming synonymous with cannibalism, madness, and betrayal. Children whispered it around campfires. Preachers warned of it in sermons. The Colorado Cannibal had become a boogeyman, half folklore, half nightmare. But when Packer was dragged back into a courtroom in Lake City, Colorado, the tone changed. The spectacle didn't shrink. It evolved. The courtroom filled with journalists, artists, and thrill-seekers, all hungry for a glimpse of the man who had supposedly butchered and consumed his companions during one of the harshest winters in frontier memory. He looked gaunt but composed, weathered by the years on the run. His eyes, once darting and frantic, now held a strange calm, as if he'd grown comfortable inside the story he had built for himself. His attorneys claimed that he had survived, a tragic ordeal, that he had been demonized by the press, and that what he had done only because the mountains had given him no other choice. But the prosecution saw something else entirely. A manipulator, a grifter, a man who had preyed on the weak during their most desperate hour and had fed himself, literally, off the backs of the dead. The evidence had not changed since the discovery, of the bodies in Dead Man's Gulch. The forensic findings, crude though they were by modern standards, painted a picture that even the most sympathetic onlookers found hard to stomach. The manner of death, the concentration of wounds, the precision of the dismemberment. It didn't point to spontaneous survival cannibalism. It suggested premeditation. Yet the defense leaned hard into the fog of winter and the fog of war. They argued that no one could truly understand what starvation and isolation do to a man's mind. They painted Packer as a tragic figure, misunderstood, feared, yes, but not evil. He was not a killer, they said. He was a man abandoned by reason, abandoned by luck, who did the unthinkable because the world gave him no better option. It was a compelling story, and in the court of public opinion, it started to stick, especially once the press began, framing him not just as a man of scandal, but as a symbol of survival, a lone soul who bore the shame of what others might have done too, had they been in his frozen, blood-soaked boots. The media played its part masterfully. Headlines oscillated between horror and sympathy. One week he was the man-eater of the Rockies, the next, the forsaken prospector. It didn't help that Packer was articulate and eerily charming when he wanted to be. He gave interviews. From his cell, spun yarns for reporters, hinted at regrets without ever fully admitting guilt. Over time, the public began to fracture. Some saw a monster, others saw a scapegoat, and a growing number saw an opportunity, a story that sold papers, stirred imaginations, and blurred the line between villain and victim. The court eventually handed down a sentence of death by hanging, swift, unceremonious, and entirely expected. But Packer's legal team mounted an appeal, and due to a technicality in the territorial laws at the time of the murders, the verdict was overturned. His retrial in 1886 resulted in a conviction on 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter, not premeditated murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, one of the longest sentences in US history at the time. Yet even that felt like a compromise. Justice, diluted by legal error, public intrigue, and the mythos now surrounding the man. During his incarceration, Packer's legend only grew. He became the subject of dime novels, political cartoons, and philosophical debates. Was he a murderer or a martyr? Did he act out of hunger or out of greed? Did the others die in order to feed him? Or were they already dead, victims of the elements, with Packer merely capitalizing on the aftermath? No one could say for sure, and perhaps more damningly, no one wanted to. Certainty doesn't sell. Ambiguity does. That was the genius of the narrative Packer let others write for him, one where the truth remained just out of reach, buried under snow and silence and time. He served 17 years of his sentence before being paroled in 1901, thanks in large part to a campaign led by a journalist under the pen name Polly Pry. She framed him as a misunderstood veteran, a wounded soul who'd endured more than most men could bear. And the public, by then weary of the story, nodded along. Alfred Packer spent his final years quietly in Colorado, receiving a military pension, gardening, living modestly. But the question still hangs in the cold mountain air, decades and generations later. What really happened in those woods? Was it madness? Was it murder? Or was it something more insidious, the slow, terrifying transformation of a man who realized the wilderness doesn't take your humanity all at once. It eats it piece by piece. We may never know. And perhaps that's exactly how Packer wanted it. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.